I'm going to go ahead and get started. This presentation is going to be about things that I wish I could have known when I started working with Drupal, or after a number of years of building websites with Drupal. If I had the ability to go back in time, these are some of the things that I would tell past me that would make current me really happy. My name is Joe. I am EOJ the Brave on Drupal.org, IRC, Twitter, pretty much anything internet. Have been forever. It was one of those poor decisions in like junior high where you're like, oh, I need an online moniker. I know, I'll spell my name backwards. And then I need to sound really badass, so I'm gonna add the Brave, you know, like a knight in shining armor at the end. And now it's like forever cursed. I will be thing that you cannot pronounce, the Brave. I have been working with Drupal for a really long time now. The very first time I ever installed Drupal was Drupal 3.1. And I immediately deleted it and removed all traces of it from my laptop and never touched it again. Used Joomla and Mambo instead for a while, and then came back to Drupal with Drupal 4.5 and built a couple of sites on that and have been working with it ever since. I've been doing web stuff for probably about 11 years now, and the majority of that has been with Drupal or sort of adjunct Drupal technologies. I've also worked in a variety of different sort of roles at various Drupal shops. I currently work at Lullabot, and Lullabot has afforded me the opportunity to work on some really, really large Drupal sites, and with a lot of mostly media-oriented companies. We've done a lot of work with the Grammys and Martha Stewart and you know, things at that scale. Before I got into that, though, I've also spent a lot of time working I used to work at Triangle Park Creative here in town, and had the opportunity when I worked there to work with a lot of local nonprofit organizations and co-ops, and so some of the smaller sites. And I've seen a lot of different things built with Drupal in a lot of different places. And I think that's given me a good perspective on what the system's capable of and a little bit of what it's not capable of. I'm also the lead trainer at Lullabot, so I spend a lot of time teaching our clients about Drupal and how to make use of the sites that we've built for them and to do the things that they need to do. I spend a lot of time teaching people how to write modules for Drupal. I have heard numerous people like look at hook menu and just be like, what is going on here? I don't understand this at all. And been able to kind of step back and say, you know, I've spent so many years working with these technologies that I take a lot of things for granted. When I say the word node, I assume you know what I'm talking about, and I also assume you know what I'm talking about in the context of Drupal, which is not true in most cases. Like if you don't know Drupal and somebody comes up and is like, oh yeah, just make a node. They're like, oh what? You want me to add another server? Like, what are you talking about here? So it's been a sort of sobering experience to be able to teach a lot of people who are really new to Drupal and have them remind me that there's a lot of things that I take for granted. This presentation is going to be mostly about like lessons that I've learned over the past 8 years or so building sites with Drupal, and really kind of trying to draw from my experiences and be able to say, like, these are things that you may encounter, kind of help point people in the right direction. I'm going to talk a lot about things that I initially I now take for granted, and I often forget to talk about with people when I'm first telling them about Drupal. There's all these things, again, the terminology is a really big one, but we just assume that like, I've heard these terms so many times, I use them in everything that I do, it must mean that everyone else knows them too, but people that haven't used Drupal before aren't familiar with them. And I think that part of saying these things and getting this out there, it's nice to just know what the terms are, but it's also nice to be able to walk away and say, oh, okay, I know what to Google for now. Like, you can solve all of your Drupal problems as long as you know what to Google for, but a lot of times that's really difficult. It's that whole, like, you don't know what you don't know concept. The presentation is kind of a fire hose of, like, various different things. And so I tried to put it in order of, like, the most logical way that I could put these slides, but some of the stories are also just really out of left field. It'll be fun. This presentation is not about installing Drupal, administering a Drupal site, It's not about CSS or PHP or anything like that. It's not really about a business advice, and it is most definitely not about math or relationships, because those things are really hard. And this is the quick, if you're bored already and you've only got 5 minutes, we're going to talk about this. When you're working with Drupal, Google is your friend, assuming you know what to search for. Once you've used Google, you'll learn that there's probably a module for that, and the module's probably called views. The big takeaway from this is that I want people to come out of this and realize that Drupal's not magic. There's a bunch of stuff that we take for granted. We look at this and we're like, oh, you just click it together. And how many times have you told someone or read the documentation, click here, do this, press the button, a bunch of magic happens, and you've got a page? It's like, well, no, it's not a bunch of magic. A bunch of code gets executed that does a bunch of tasks. And because Drupal's open source, you can actually go and read all of that code and see what it does. And finally, if you haven't started your data migration already, you're already behind. We'll talk about that a lot. This idea, you don't know what you don't know. It's so hard to read the documentation on Drupal.org and find the answer to your problem if you don't really have the terminology or you're not even sure what you're looking for. And so a big part of getting started with Drupal and learning it, and so much of what I wish I could go back and tell myself is like, Joe, the module you were looking for is named image cache. Because that makes sense, right? Instead of spending 3 months writing your own PHP to process images and make them smaller, and it's like, oh, all you really needed to do was Google for the term image cache. And Drupal is full of these weird things like that where you're like, if I had known that that module existed, it solved all my problems, but that module is named Eldorado Superfly. That has nothing to do with rearranging checkboxes on a form. How am I supposed to know that? So one of the things that I stress and would totally do if I could go back in time is that just take some time to try to learn that terminology. Talk to people when you're at camps like this. There's a glossary on Drupal.org. It's pretty extensive, and I pointed out, but it's also one of those, this is a huge list of Drupal terms, and you don't necessarily need to memorize and know all of them, but get an understanding of when somebody says the word node, when somebody's talking about core or contrib, when you're having a conversation with somebody and these words come up that are just like, oh, you mentioned this thing, but I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. Could you elaborate and explain it for me? When I first got involved with the community, I was very much the person who would just kind of sit in the corner and listen and try to take things in. And I wasn't very outspoken, and I wouldn't ask questions, and I just kind of smile and nod, smile and nod. Yeah, sure, entities, yeah, that makes sense. Not. Speak up and ask people, and generally in our community, people are pretty willing to take the time to explain what those terms are. And a lot of times you'll find that they'll go, oh, you're right, that is a really stupid name for this thing. So that's one thing that I kind of wish I had spent more time figuring out initially, but also continue to spend time figuring out, even 8 years into this. I got started using Drupal because I needed to build websites really cheap. And Drupal was open source, which meant I got the code for free, which meant I'm pretty sure I could build websites for free, right? Because it's open source. I pretty quickly learned that just because something is open source doesn't mean it's free. Drupal, the software, yes. You can go and download the code. You can make use of it. It is totally free. Actually making use of it costs money or time, or probably some combination of both. But I had this misconception that Drupal was going to solve all of my problems by being really free, and I just had to install it and great, I could have a website and I didn't have to pay any money for it, but oh wait, you have to have content too. Crap. And oh wait, I don't know how to do everything with Drupal, which means I'm gonna have to pay somebody else to figure these things out. There's also sort of you get the code for free, but the shelf life of that code costs money. You have to maintain your website over time. You get it all for free and you get to install it on your server, but then next week on Wednesday, there'll be a security announcement and somebody will say, hey, this module needs an update. So somebody's gonna have to spend some time making sure that that module's code gets updated. You still get the code for free, but there's some amount of time, time is money in this case, that gets spent getting a copy of that code, updating it, making sure that things didn't break, and so forth. So the code is free, your website is not. So now we're going to go like through order of like, if you're going to build a web project, this is typically how it works, with a few caveats here and there. I also realized, like, as I was putting all of this together and thinking about what I wanted to say, a lot of these things are not really Drupal specific. Some of them are. Some of them are just kind of software, like web software in general. Project estimation. This is one of those really tricky things. And I'm pretty sure that if there were the 10 commandments of project estimation, like Moses carried these tablets down off the mountain, the first tablet would read something like this, and basically declare that it is absolutely impossible to provide an accurate estimate for anything. Well, no, that's not true. You can estimate how long it took to do the thing that you just did. But anything in the future, it's pretty much impossible to make an accurate estimate. And the second tablet would probably say something like, but even though it's impossible, everyone will require you to do so. This is something that comes up in a lot of projects, and what I would emphasize for myself if I was to go back and do it again, when I first started trying to figure out how to estimate projects or figure out how long it would take to do something, I had this idea that with Drupal, I click a bunch of things, I put it together, cool, I'm going to build a blog, I'm going to estimate how long it takes to build a blog. And I would estimate things that like, oh, well, that's like 40 hours. I could build the blog in 40 hours, and so that's this much money, and I could build a photo gallery in 25 hours, and there's a module that allows me to have a contact form, so I'll estimate that at like 5 hours. And what I realized was it didn't make sense to try to estimate things in these really large chunks. I shouldn't have spent all my time trying to estimate a feature, but I should break it down into smaller, more estimable chunks. The big takeaways for me with project estimation that I've kind of started to learn, I'm still terrible at this, but I've started to learn that look for warning signals when you're estimating something. I would recommend, and I try to stick to, if I can't put a maximum of 8 hours on the thing, it's too big for me to estimate. If I'm saying this is going to take 16 hours to do, we're talking about 2 days worth of work, and a lot can change in 2 days worth of work. And so I try to stick to estimating things that are only like 8 hours or less. Not always possible, but that's kind of my rule of thumb. And the other thing is, if you don't understand something, don't put an estimate next to it. Like as soon as you write a number next to how long it's going to take to do something, people are going to try to hold you to it. So you write like, oh, photo gallery, 8 hours. I'm sure. I've never built one, but I'm sure you could do it in 8 hours. If you don't really understand what it is that you're saying you're going to be able to build, estimate an hour to do some research to figure out what you're going to build, and then give it a real number when you can. I could talk about estimating things for a long time, but I won't.
Can you estimate how long it would take?
Well, given the amount of time that we have left, I'll tell you when I'm done. Got it. One of the things that's hard about estimating things for Drupal is that it's oftentimes the small tasks in Drupal are really easy. Like, allow me to upload a photo, change the site name to this. There's these small tasks. You can do configuration with your module. They tend to be pretty easy to accomplish. Big picture things, though, with Drupal tend to be a lot more challenging. There's a lot of it's really easy to make a content type. It's really easy to make 10 content types. It's a lot of work to figure out what 10 content types to make and how they should all be related to one another, which field should live on this content type versus that content type, how that's going to work with views once you start trying to build lists of things. So making the content type, no problem. Understanding why is that big picture and harder to estimate, harder to figure out aspect of it. When I first started building Drupal sites, I would often just sit down with a piece of paper and I would try to map out everything that I needed to build for this website. And I'd write down all my content types and draw arrows and start trying to figure it all out. These days I tend to actually it's really quick to do the small, easy tasks. So I'll actually just install Drupal in a couple of modules. and mock something up really quick. I'll click things together, and I can do that almost as fast as I can do it on a piece of paper. And I get a little bit of that real world, like, oh yeah, this idea that I'm thinking is going to work. And I like that idea of being able to, that small task is easy. It's okay for me to do 50% of the work, say, that's going to work, delete it, come back later and do it for real, put the polish on it at the end. You've probably run into this scenario before too, where the first 80% of building a website in Drupal, no problem. You just click a bunch of things and put all the modules together and you're done in a week. And then you spend the next 6 months fixing, and just kind of that last 20% takes forever. It's kind of that some tasks are easy, big picture things in Drupal tend to be more complicated. Okay, so you've estimated what you're going to build, you've got a plan for what you're going to build. Now you need to find a module. And this is one of those things where it's kind of challenging. There's I'm pretty sure there's at least 1 billion modules, and I'm also pretty sure there's only a few hundred of them that don't suck. So how do you find the ones that don't suck in this giant pile of stuff? I used to just kind of start searching on Drupal.org. And I'm like, photo gallery module, sweet, I'm going to install that and use that. It's a great way to kind of get started and try everything out. When I started with Drupal, you could download the entire contrib repository and install every single module and see what they did. Not really possible anymore. So first thing that I would do is ask someone. In a community like this, people are pretty willing to share information. And if you're like, hey, I've got this problem, I'm trying to solve this specific thing. Have you ever encountered it before? Do you have any idea about a module that might do this? I tend to take modules that someone else has recommended to me, get a big +1 on my list, just because it's sweet, somebody else has tried this, it obviously solved their problem, otherwise they wouldn't recommend it. It's not necessarily going to solve my problem, but that's a big sweet, I'm going to go check that one out, versus the list of 10 other ones that claim to do the exact same thing. I also, searching on Drupal.org definitely works. There's a big pile of stuff, you got to get through it somehow. A lot of people don't know this, but when you go to Drupal.org and you can search, you can filter the list so that it orders things by most installed. So filter down to the version of Drupal that you're talking about. So let's say Drupal 7, and then you can order the list by most installed. And this is really cool because it's not a download count. It's not how many people downloaded this module. This is actually sites phoning home to Drupal.org saying, I have the views module installed. I have this particular version of it. So it's a pretty accurate representation of, obviously it's not every single site, but the ones that are at the higher, float to the top of the list are on the top of the list because everyone else is using them. And the big takeaway for me with finding modules, and the thing that I would totally tell past Joe, is that when you need to build a photo gallery, don't use the module that's named Joe's Awesome Photo Gallery and you turn it on and it sets up and does everything for you and sweet, now you have a photo gallery. The more Drupal way of doing that would have been for me to take the views module and potentially a couple of others that do things like resize photos and allow me to make lists like a grid of photos. Use these 3 or 4 different modules to click together my own solution versus, finding the solution that somebody else wrote that solved their specific problem but isn't quite mine. Because the benefit there is you have all these Lego pieces that you can click together and do whatever you want with. You can make exactly your photo gallery versus somebody else's photo gallery that's almost yours. So that was a big one for me, that moment of realizing that a lot of times with Drupal, it seems like, oh, cool, I can just get this module, I can just download that code and install it, and it'll do everything I need to. But the better way is oftentimes to find the few modules that can allow you to replicate that functionality by configuring them in an appropriate way. Once you've found your module, so I did this all the time. You download Drupal, you unzip all the code, there's a folder there named modules, so you download a module from Drupal.org and you put it in the folder named modules, and then you put your themes in the one named themes, and it works great. But I later discovered that there are reasons not to do that. And so they're recommended with Drupal 7, and see, this is going to get confusing. Drupal 6 and 7 and everything prior to Drupal 8, the recommended way to do this is to actually place the modules and code, any code that you get that isn't part of that core Drupal distribution should go inside of your sites directory, not in the root modules directory, not in the root themes directory. And the reason for that is just organization and being able to figure out which of that code in those directories is Drupal core and which of it is things that you wrote. Or things that are a contributed module. It's really about maintenance more than anything else. Totally will work, but down the road you'll kick yourself and say, I don't even know if this module is part of core or not. How do I upgrade it? What's going on here? This actually changes with Drupal 8, and in Drupal 8, it's been all of the modules that are part of core have been moved into a directory named core, and the themes and modules directories that are in the root level are where the recommended place to put your own code, which is pretty cool. It only took us like 10 years to get there. Once you install a module and everything breaks, don't panic. It's okay. First step in troubleshooting Drupal is always make sure you're not refreshing a screenshot. The second step in troubleshooting Drupal is always clear the cache. With all this ability to click things together and configuration and all of that, Drupal has to cache a lot of that. So there's a lot of work happens in the background to build any of these pages, to find all the code, to figure out where you put your modules, to figure out where you put your themes, all of that. There is no reason that Drupal should do that on every single page request. So it caches that information. And then as soon as you add in a new file, it can't find it because you have to clear the cache first. This is totally, even like today, this is one of those things where I will spend 20 minutes trying to figure out what is going on with this site. And I'm like, oh, I wonder what happens if I clear the, oh, dang it, I should have done that 20 minutes ago. I swear, this is one of those lessons I never actually learn. I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, you found some code. This is great. The code was free, too. Keeping your code up to date and some of the things that I've learned about that. First off, the code that is part of Drupal and all of these modules doesn't stand still. You don't just download Drupal core and then it's fine forever. You need to continue to upgrade it with maintenance releases and security fixes. As the project evolves, different vulnerabilities are found. Even in Drupal core code, there are security issues where all kinds of different things. And so it's important to stay on top of those so that your code in your website isn't vulnerable. You can find out more about these security issues by subscribing to the mailing list, there's a URL for it, or following Drupal security on Twitter. There's various other channels where this information is communicated. Security announcements come out on Wednesdays. They are always on Wednesdays. I think it's one of those things where it's like, well, let's send it out on Wednesdays because people will probably be working during the week and they can update their sites. But if we sent it all out on Friday, nobody wants to work over the weekend. But the standard is to do so on Wednesdays. Security issues are almost always sort of reported and dealt with in private as best as possible until a suitable solution has been found. As soon as a solution is found, though, the vulnerability is made public. When these announcements come out, they say, there was a bug in Drupal core that lets somebody do this, and it does that. Here's how you do this. It's like, oh, crap. I could just copy and paste this and hack a bunch of people's sites. So it is important to update for those security releases because of the fact that it is now public information what that security issue is. Security updates, like point upgrades, point releases, are almost always really simple with Drupal. I used to always think that this would be a pain in the butt, and so I would panic anytime I had a security issue, and it's like, oh man, I'm gonna have to dedicate the rest of the week to upgrading views module, and it's gonna be complicated. And, they're typically pretty easy. If you've followed best practices and you've kept your code in the sites all themes directory and sites all modules directory, if you've not made changes to Drupal core, when a new version of Drupal core comes out, you can almost always just take that new point release, so like 7.1, 7.2, and just drop the code on top of your existing code, maybe run the update.php if there's any database changes, but even that, like Drupal 7, which has been in the wild for so long, schema changes are really rare at this point too. It's almost always just like, oh, cool, you've got some new code now. You of course have to, click on your website and make sure that it still works and that. But I used to be terrified of these things. And so I would actually let them stack up a lot. I wouldn't do it because I was worried that it was going to be a nightmare to perform this upgrade. And then the site would get hacked. And that is a nightmare. And so my recommendation would be to not be terrified of security updates and do them in a timely fashion. I also think that you don't have to jump on it the minute that it gets released. It's not like the mailing list got an email, holy cow, your site got hacked 30 seconds later. Usually you've got a fair amount of time. There's probably some pretty high profile targets that people will go after first. There's also this whole you can read the security issues, and if you read what they say, so many of them are like, this is a problem if someone is logged into your website with the administrator account and they go to this page and click on this link and do this thing, and it's like, oh, I don't even have that module enabled. I'm the only person with the administrator account. Yes, I should probably update sometime in the future, but this isn't an immediate pressing need. Major upgrades, on the other hand, are rocket surgery. Holy cow, they're a pain in the butt. This is one of those things that I also stressed out a lot about. Drupal, a new version of Drupal would come out. Drupal, for me, the big transitions were from 5 to 6. And Drupal 6 came out, and I kind of panicked and was like, oh, I'm in charge of maintaining a dozen different websites that all need to be upgraded to Drupal 6. Drupal 6 is out. I need to do this right now. And basically spent the next 6 months doing that, and really nothing else. If I could go back in time, I would probably tell myself, just skip Drupal 6, wait for Drupal 7. Your website's not going to break. It's going to continue to work just as well as it works right now. And not to panic and feel like I had to perform this upgrade right away, because these major upgrades from 7 to 8, 6 to 7, they're tough. A lot of stuff changes. You end up in this scenario where things that were part of contrib for one version are now part of core for the next version, and there's not always a really good upgrade path, and it can be tough to figure it out. It's okay to not upgrade to a major version. It's totally acceptable to skip a version. Potentially more, too. Another thing that I found with upgrades is that I initially would always try to do that, upgrade every single version. Okay, this site started on 4.5, now let's go to 4.6, now let's go to 4.7, all the way up. And realized later on that a lot of times, not only was it okay for me to skip a version, but this is a really great opportunity for me to rethink what I'm building and how I've built it, and to take that time to look at the site that I've built and figure out oh, the community is building sites in a slightly different way now than they were in Drupal 5. Maybe you should update some of your techniques in the way that you've constructed things to make use of the newer technologies, the newer way of doing things. And rather than try to perform an upgrade, maybe I build the site fresh and rethink it and migrate the data. And I found that to be a really effective technique in most cases. It's also one of those things if you skip a version, so you build the site in Drupal 5, you skip a version, so you don't do anything with 6, you go to 7, you have all the way through the Drupal 7 lifecycle. We're talking a good 3.5, 4 years at least that you can go without having to do a major upgrade. In most websites, after 4 years, they could probably use a bit of a facelift, so it might be time to spend it might be a good time to spend some time investing in that kind of redesign as well as the upgrade. Speaking of upgrades, multi-site. So Drupal has this feature where you can have a single code base that runs multiple different websites. So one set of files, separate databases, essentially, you've got separate websites. This one was, for me, I kind of got bit by this early on. I got really excited about it and was like, cool, I've got a single code base. It'll be really easy to maintain just this one code base. When a security update comes out, I only have to replace one set of files. The challenge for me there was that I only had to replace one set of files, but when I did it, I was doing it for 24 sites at a time. So if I was updating the views module, I would have to like update the views module and then go through all 24 of these sites really quick and make sure that none of them were broken. So that, for me, was the big implication with Multisite, is that it sounded really great because I could do this thing of like have one code base, many sites. It didn't really work out great in that scenario. I do think that Multisite can be a really great tool. My caution here would be to use it in scenarios where you are building sites that are mostly the same. Use it if you're at the university and you have a bunch of departmental websites and all the sites are almost identical with just a few differences, and it's okay to upgrade the module in one and test it out on that one and feel relatively assured that that upgrade will also work fine on the rest of them. The scenario that I ended up in was like, I had my local cheesemonger website, I had the church's website, I had the co-op's website, I had my mom's website, I had 2 of my own websites. They're all totally different and doing different things and using different sets of modules. And so I wasn't really saving myself any time by having this single code base. I thought I was, but it was quite a mess in the end. When you're doing upgrades, testing is important. We talk about this a lot in the Drupal community now that we've got some automated tools for being able to do testing of websites, and people get really excited about terms like behavior-driven development and test-driven development, and like, oh man, test this, test that, make sure you're writing tests for everything. I really kind of like dove on that when it was initially like, yeah, I'm gonna write tests for everything that I do ever. And I would spend hours writing tests that were like, yes, someone can view the homepage. It's like, well, of course they can view the homepage. Yes, there's an image on the homepage. It's like, you'd spend like 15 minutes building a view and then 2 hours writing a test for it. I would tell past me that testing is really good, but you don't have to test everything. I recently heard the term happy paths, and it refers to this concept of like writing tests for the things that need to happen to ensure that people are happy when they visit your website. A good example of a happy path is your site allows users to sign up. Write a test that makes sure that that functionality never breaks, that they can always click on the sign up page, fill out the form, click sign up, and get an account. Don't worry about testing what happens if they put in the wrong email address. Don't worry about testing what happens if they put in the wrong password. Like, test that happy path. Make sure you've got that. The other stuff, if you have time, great, but don't stress it if you don't have time. The other thing that I almost always say you should invest time and money in testing is paths in your website that earn you money. So like if there's a form on your website where somebody gets to donate or purchase a subscription or whatever, that kind of money, or even if it's just a page that like, if this page disappeared, all of the unicorns in England would die. You should probably make sure that that page is tested and never disappears. Your about page, it's probably okay if somebody for a moment can't find your phone number. When you're doing testing, don't do your testing as the user with the ID of 1. In Drupal, the first account that you create on a Drupal site is considered the root user, or the user with the ID of 1. And this user has a weird thing where when you're logged in as that user, you have all permissions. It's like sudo, or logging into a server with root. It's the code that does the permission check for this literally says, the user access function, you pass in a string that says, does the user have access to do X? And the code says, is this the user with the ID 1? Yes? Okay, then of course they have access. And then it goes on to figure out all like what role are you in and all the other permission stuff. The reason that this isn't a good test path is as the user with ID 1, I'm seeing everything all of the time, and you can get this false sense of security where like, oh yeah, I enabled that module and the field showed up and sweet. Hey client, I fixed that thing for you. They're gonna call you back 10 minutes later and say, I don't see the field. And you'll log in and you'll be like, no, it's there, I swear. I'm looking at it, it's right here on my screen. No, I don't see that field. So many times this is a permissions issue. And if your testing is user 1, you won't notice those permissions issues. And so I make heavy use of a module called Masquerade or the Devel module, both of which have tools that allow you to really quickly switch between different user accounts. If you've been asked to, your task is fix this thing on the form that editors see, log into the site as an editor when you're fixing that form. Otherwise, you're not really going to know if it's fixed or not. And then when your customer calls you and they're panicking because they don't see the field, clear the cache too. That might actually solve the problem in a lot of cases. Keep calm, clear the cache. When I first started building websites, I worked with this guy, Christian, and Christian and I are still good friends, but Christian and I used to share a desk. I sat here, Christian sat right there. We would look at each other and basically work on websites all day. Our version control system was, can I edit layout.css? Can you stop editing it? Can you save? Look, I really have to get this done right now. Here, I'm going to email you the thing that I need you to copy and paste into layout.css. And it was terrible. We would spend hours dealing with who's editing the file and when, and don't overwrite the work that I'm working on. And okay, I've got layout-1.css and you've got layout-1a.css. And all we have to do is you work in that one and I'll always work in this one. And then we'll just combine them together on every Thursday and it'll be fine. I swear it was not fine. Make sure you use source control. It's actually really easy. It's intimidating because it's kind of this oh, Git, you have to command line and all this. I think people often think of source control as being a very difficult and developer-centric thing. But if you spend a couple of hours, it's really easy to get a really basic workflow with source control, and it is absolutely worth it. I think of source control now as it's my giant undo button. It's oh man, I did not mean to do that before I went to lunch. Oops, and undo it. So it's just kind of one of those if you're not using it, look into it, make use of it. Don't do what I did for a couple of years, which was sit next to my coworker and be like, can you not work on this website today because I need to? It's well, we both need to. The other thing that you should do with source control is anyone in your organization that doesn't use it, you should smack them right now. Because anyone that doesn't use source control, or source control is really only as good as the people on the project that are making use of it. Did you have a? Yeah, I tend, the question was, do I have a source control system that I recommend? I recommend Git. If you're not using anything currently, Git is what the Drupal community uses, is what all the code on Drupal.org is maintained with. And so the documentation within our community for Git is good. If you're not using Git, that is fine. If you already know how to use something else and it's working for you, keep using that. If you need to choose something new, I would recommend starting with Git. The story here is that you put all of your stuff into source control, right? Except then, for me, it's my boss. And I put everything in source control, and then my boss goes and logs into the server and starts tweaking files on the server and making changes to them. And then I I've been a good kid and put all my stuff into source control and check it in and push it out to the server, and inadvertently deleted all of the changes that my boss made because nobody in their right mind would make changes to the files outside of source control. And then you get an angry email that's how come this thing's broken on the website again? It's not only do I not know why it's broken, I have no way to figure out how it was fixed, who fixed it, when it was fixed, because none of that was ever in source control. So version control is really only good if everyone on the team is using it. As soon as someone isn't, you're effectively all not using it anymore. So take the time to work with the people on your team that aren't using it, to get them that basic workflow of hey, when you save a file, it's not really actually saved until you've committed your changes to the repository. And it's not as hard as it sounds. Totally worth figuring out. Features, exportables, CMI. This is, who here has used the features module? Nice. This is one of those, for me, that I totally take this for granted at this point. And I'm Every project I work on makes use of the features module and the concepts that it makes use of. And every once in a while I run into scenarios where it's not in use and I'm like, how do you even build, like, what? So features module is a way of exporting Drupal's configuration into code that can then be put into your version control system. And what that means is, in Drupal, it's really easy to do things like build a view and click a bunch of things together. You've built a view, you've got a photo gallery, you had to add some content types for it, you've probably got some image styles that resize things to the appropriate size. Great, you tested it all out on your laptop because God forbid you're actually editing on the live site. So you test it all out on your laptop first, and now your deployment process is, okay, I'm gonna go through this checklist of like 300 things, and I'm gonna try to do it pretty quickly so that nobody notices that the site's broken while I'm clicking through all of these things. Features, or this whole concept, so all that configuration happens in the database in Drupal. It's what makes Drupal really powerful, but it's really hard to accurately deploy that. There's no way to accurately replicate the clicks that I made on my laptop on the live site without a checklist and without doing it again. And so this concept is, how can we take the configuration that we've done on our site and export it so that that configuration lives in code instead of the database, because code can be deployed. Code is repeatable. So the features module lets you, in Drupal 7, it lets you click all of these things together, build your view, build your content type, et cetera, your image styles. Use the features interface to select the different views and such that you built. Press a button, and the features module will write you a module that you can drop into your site. Now you have code, you can deploy that code. All you have to do is turn the module on, and presto, all of your views are on your live site, the image styles are there, and so forth. And then, next week, when you have to tweak that view a little bit, you can make a couple of changes on your local environment, re-export the code, check in the new version to version control, deploy that code, and your live site will pick up all those configuration changes without you having to log into the site and edit all the views and such. This is a highly recommended. Take the time to figure out how to make use of these tools. Features is the module that does it in Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. The concept is exportables, this idea of being able to take configuration and export it into code. And then in Drupal 8, I see it's kind of covered up here, but Drupal 8 refers to this as CMI, or configuration management, and actually simplifies a lot of this, just because Drupal 8 actually, all of that configuration is just stored in files by default rather than storing it in the database. So you don't have to have this interim step of a module that exports the data as a file for you. So check that one out. This slide after you learn PHP, because I do recommend that anyone working with Drupal takes time to learn at least a little bit of PHP. You don't need to be fluent with it by any means. But I find that there's a lot of information on Drupal.org about you're almost there. You've almost got the problem solved. But you just need to write this simple module to move the link over here or change the color or whatever the case is. And a lot of times people will just kind of run away from that. It's like, that sounds really hard. It's actually really easy to learn enough PHP to copy and paste somebody else's into a .module file and turn it on. And a lot of times that'll solve your problem. There's a lot of code examples on Drupal.org that people have not really taken the time to make a full-fledged project out of, because it was just a quick recipe to fix their specific use case, but they wanted to make sure that other people saw that as well. So it's like this repository of code snippets that if you know enough PHP to be able to copy and paste that and look at it and say, okay, I recognize that this is the variable that stores the value for color, and I need it to be green instead of red, but otherwise I need everything to be the same. Once you do learn some PHP, I would recommend avoiding the PHP module that comes with Drupal. What this does is you can enable the PHP module, and it provides a new input format or text filter so that you can, when you're creating a new page, instead of saying filtered HTML or basic HTML, you can choose PHP as an option. And then you can type a bunch of PHP right into the body of your page and hit save. And then whenever somebody views the page, all of your PHP gets executed, and it's awesome. You didn't have to write a module. You didn't have to put anything in version control. All you got to do to edit it is click the Edit tab, and you can change it. It seems awesome. I've actually worked on a couple of sites. I have built a couple of sites where there were entire features encapsulated in the body of a node because I was like, I can write PHP. I know how to query the database. I can do all this stuff. I'll just do it right in this text field. Seems like a great idea. Seems really easy. In practice, not so much. The biggest issue you'll run into is that it's just really, really hard to debug PHP code that's evaluated by other PHP code. You'll get errors that are like, oh, that error is at line 617 of php.inc. And you'll go to that line and it'll say eval. You're like, I didn't even write this. This couldn't possibly be the issue here. What it's doing is it's evaluating all the code that you wrote inside of that text area. The error is in there somewhere. Good luck finding it. The other thing that you'll run into, and I've been bitten by this, is when you upgrade, oftentimes PHP or Drupal's like function names will change. And so you upgrade from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, and you've got a bunch of PHP stored in the body of this page. And when you upgrade, the function name changed. The page no longer works because that function doesn't exist, and it's oftentimes really hard to track down that problem. I'm sure somebody at some point had a legitimate use case for this module. I've never actually been able to figure out what it is. The other thing, once you've learned some PHP, don't hack core. You'll hear this term a lot in the Drupal community. What this refers to is not making changes to the files that are part of Drupal core, primarily because if you do so, it becomes difficult to upgrade. If you run into something, you're like, oh, all I need to do is open up this, node.module file and make a couple changes to this line, and great, my site now functions the way that I want it to. Next week, there's a security update. You get a new copy of node.module. You now need to figure out, like, what did I change? Do I still need to change it for the new version? Oh, the line number changed. It's really hard to keep track of those things. Oftentimes, you'll forget that you actually need to keep track of that because it's like, well, I shouldn't have hacked core in the first place, so I obviously didn't. Not always. However, I for years stuck very, very hard to this. Like, I would spend hours trying to find workarounds for things that there was just no other way to fix this problem other than to change like one line in core. And so my mantra now tends to be don't dish. Like, I would recommend not doing it. Almost always you can find a pretty easy way to alter what Drupal is doing without modifying its code. If you can't, I would consider that to be a bug, and you should file an issue that says, I can't easily alter this thing without hacking core. And then I would probably hack core, because sometimes you just need to get it done. While you're in there hacking core, I recommend taking a look at the theme function. We talked a little bit about how Drupal is open source and the fact that that means you have access to all of the source code. I would oftentimes use parts of Drupal just by kind of throwing things at it and seeing what came back. It's like, oh, cool, that's what I wanted. That's not quite it. What if I adjust this input a little bit? Eventually, I actually printed out a copy of the theme.inc file on paper, and I read it on a bus ride. It was hilarious. I was like, oh, I've got a bunch of PHP code printed out on paper. I wouldn't recommend doing it that way. But I would recommend that the parts of Drupal that you make use of and the code that you make use of, read the code and see what it's doing. This function for me was really enlightening because like almost the entirety of Drupal's theme system is encapsulated inside of this one function. And like having an understanding of like, it's not magic when I put a template file in this directory and Drupal finds it. This is what it's doing in order to find that. And oftentimes, once you know what it's doing, you can take advantage of those things. And you can kind of like, once you know how the system works, it's a lot easier to leverage it to do really awesome things. Remember when we talked at the beginning about how you should have started your data migration? If I could go back in time, the first thing that I would tell myself is, Joe, in 2011, you're going to try to migrate Drupalize Me from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, you should probably start that now. Data migrations are one of those things that just inevitably take longer than you anticipated. They are always difficult. They will always, always, always take a long time. No matter what people say, oh no, my data's in good order. This CSV file will be great. You'll be able to import it, no problem. It's like, yeah, right. There's 6,000 lines of people's names in here. At least one of them is going to have a snowman in it, and I'm going to need to make sure that I, take care of that in the data migration. My rule of thumb now is typically when I'm starting on a project that involves a data migration, that is almost always the first thing that we'll start. And it'll probably be the last thing you finish too. They end up being really tough. They're tricky things to deal with. Run cron in Drupal. It's not as big of a deal now because Drupal 7 will actually take care of this for you automatically if you've not configured it to do so. It'll occasionally just when somebody visits a page, it'll run cron in the background or the cron script. But what this refers to is Drupal has a script that can run, that performs a lot of scheduled tasks, things like sometimes like sending out reminder emails or notifications and that kind of stuff. But it also does things like deal with search indexing. So when you create a new piece of content on your site, it doesn't automatically get, or it doesn't immediately get indexed by Drupal's search engine. It actually gets queued for indexing. And so if you don't run cron, you'll only ever queue everything and never actually process things. This is one of those, like, initially I would forget this step a lot. Now it's not as big of a deal. Drush is another, for me, was one of those, heard about it, kind of decided I didn't really need it, and then I used it and I was like, holy crap, how did I not need this? Drush is a command line tool that will allow you to interact with your Drupal site from the command line. It does things like make it really easy to download and install a module is the simple example. The typical process, download a module, go to Drupal.org, find the view zip file, download it, unzip it, put it in Sites All modules, go to your Drupal site, navigate to the modules administration page, attempt to find views in the list of 10,000 checkboxes, find it, click the checkbox, click save, recognize that, oh, actually you need to enable these other modules too, enable those, okay, sweet, you can get back to what it was you were doing. Or you can use drush, and you can say, drush, download these two modules, and it'll say, oh, this site is Drupal, a version of Drupal 7. I'm going to make sure I get the Drupal 7 version of that module. I'm going to get this other one too. And then you can say, drush, enable these two modules. And okay, I'll go ahead and enable those modules, and you're done. So it's this nice command line interface to be able to do some of those not necessarily complicated, but tedious tasks a little bit quicker. It also works really well with the features module, which we mentioned earlier, in order to help automate some of that process of exporting configuration into a feature or into code. So recommend taking a look at it. Even the basics, it can do all kinds of crazy stuff. Excuse me. It's worth it to at least explore some of the basics. Once you've mastered even just like download and enable a module with Drush, if you think about all the time you've spent over the last like 5 years downloading and enabling modules, I'm sure I've got at least like 8+ hours in there. So it's like, sweet, I'll save myself at least 4 of those hours. And another thing so you built your site, you've been working with Drupal, lots of different tools that you can make use of. I recommend getting involved and contributing to Drupal. I worked with Drupal for almost 2 years before I even bothered to sign up for an account on Drupal.org. And then it was probably another 2 years or so after that before I actually did anything other than download code from Drupal.org. At some point, I decided, okay, I want to contribute. I want to give something back to this community. I've gotten a lot of stuff from them for free, and I'd like to sort of play my part. And so I spent a lot of time reading issues on Drupal.org, and I finally found one that I thought I could solve. And I spent like 3 days writing all of this crazy, complicated PHP code in order to, see, now I don't even remember. Oh, to format a date in an interval format. So instead of a date that's to basically say like 2 hours and 5 minutes ago. It's like, I really need Drupal to be able to do this. I spent hours working on the code to make this happen. I posted this patch. I was really proud of it. Uploaded it. 5 minutes later, quick sketch, Nate comes and comments on it, and he goes, you know, there's a function in Drupal that does this already. It'd be a lot easier if you just called that. I'm like, holy crap, I spent 3 days on this. But thank you for teaching me that this existed, and I didn't know that. And in the process, I also discovered that there's a file in Drupal core that contains a bunch of helper functions for formatting dates. I didn't even know that it did that. So it was a really cool learning opportunity. And I think that there are all kinds of opportunities like that that are there once you're willing to sort of take that step and start getting involved and contributing to the community a bit. I highly recommend that. The other thing that I find awesome about this is now I'm like super active on Drupal.org and I talk all of the time versus years ago where I just kind of lurked. One of the things that I do is like when I encounter a problem, I first see if there's a solution for it on Drupal.org. If there's not, I figure out how to do it, and I typically write that solution down on Drupal.org somewhere, whether it's in a comment or on a handbook page or whatever the case is. Awesome. I have had scenarios where I've done that, and then like a year later, encountered the same problem again, spent a bunch of time trying to figure out how to fix it, searched Drupal.org to see if anybody else had fixed it, and like, oh, sweet, somebody fixed this. Holy crap, I fixed this like a year ago. Thank you, past self. So that's kind of like my tips. That's my fire hose of like, oh man, if I could go back in time and tell my past self, here's what you're doing wrong. That's a lot of the things that I would have brought up. Resources for figuring out like, okay, cool. We talked about a bunch of new things, or potentially new things, drush and features and running cron and that. Some really great resources for dealing with those things or learning more about them. Drupal.org. Seriously, if you don't have an account, create one before you leave the room. It is totally worth the time to have an account on Drupal.org to start establishing a name for yourself in our community. Even if you're not contributing code back, for people to be able to put like a face and a name together, to be able to start to gain karma within the community and have a name that can be sort of piled up against is an immensely useful thing and is totally worth the probably 45 seconds that it will take you to fill out the form and click the submit button. There's a lot of other subsites of Drupal.org. API.Drupal.org is our documentation for all of the code. So when you want to read the theme function, rather than printing it all out, you can actually go here and read it on a web page. And when you want to drill in a little bit deeper, you can click a link that will take you to the function that you want to read more about, and it's super handy. Groups.Drupal.org is kind of an amorphous blob. Groups.Drupal.org is a sort of self-organizing discussion groups about different topics within Drupal. Sometimes they are things like a usability group for people that are interested in talking about usability issues. Sometimes it's for a local group. There's the groups.Drupal.org/twin-cities. There's a Twin Cities Drupal group. That's where this camp got planned, is via that channel. And so figure out the groups that you're interested in and follow them and kind of keep up to date with what's going on. I also find that books tend to be really helpful, and I used to always just think that everything I needed was on Drupal.org. And the truth is, it's probably there. It's just really freaking hard to find things on Drupal.org. And sometimes it's nice when someone else has done all the work already and written a good book and taken the time to get a little more in depth and explain what's going on here, the decisions that were made in order for this system to work the way that it does, rather than me just going and reading the things like, oh, this is the system and this is how it works. It's lots of useful background information, often is encapsulated in books. If you want to contribute, there's a few opportunities for that, including things like the sprints on Sunday, camps like this. The Drupal ladder is a really great project for learning more about things like Git and how Git works with Drupal. There are lessons on this website that will walk you through setting up a local development environment, installing Git, teach you some of the basics for making use of it, and so forth. I recommend checking out. Drupalize Me, I have to mention because they employ me. And it's also really awesome. If you like listening to me talk about these things, there's lots of videos of me talking about things like features and drush and installing Drupal, and I don't know, there's like some huge hundreds of hours of video now. It's a really great resource for, we try to keep the videos to like bite-sized, actionable tasks, but you can kind of look up like, hey, I want to learn how to export something with features. We have videos for that kind of stuff. I recommend checking that out. Drupal.org/planet is a page on, yes, Joe, it's a page on Drupal.org. No, duh. This page aggregates a bunch of Drupal-related sites. It goes out to, basically anyone can submit to have their Drupal-related site included in the planet, and then this is a feed aggregator for all of those sites. But it's a nice central place to just kind of go, and I don't read everything. I visit it probably a couple times a week, but it's a really cool way to keep a pulse on like what's happening in our community. What are people talking about? What are they excited about? Oh, this new module that somebody I had never heard of, Eldorado Superfly. I'm going to check that out and see what it does. That's been a really cool tool for me. And then the examples project is this one. I always avoided it because I was like, why would I install a module named examples? The examples module is actually really cool. It doesn't do anything useful unless you consider being taught how to do everything you need to know useful. This module contains a bunch of smaller modules that are all examples of using different core functionalities, or like APIs in core. So if you're learning how to write code for or with Drupal, this has examples of all kinds of things that you can do. Sending email, resizing images, running cron, other things as well. It's open source too, which is awesome because you can download the examples module and you can copy and paste it and rename it and delete all the comments and be like, see, it does what I wanted it to. And then, again, contributing and getting involved. This is one of those things that, like, for me, has been super beneficial in my learning Drupal, my ability to, like, be involved with the community and meet people, to talk at events like this. I learned so much from the other people and members in our community, and I avoided that for a long time, mostly because I was shy and I didn't want to talk to people from the internet because they're creepy. But it turns out you can actually talk to them in IRC, and it's only slightly less creepy, but at least you don't have to look at them. No, I'm just kidding. You can go to local user groups. And we have a really, really active user group here in the Twin Cities, and it's a great place to do things like meet other people that are doing Drupal, talk about how you would potentially estimate this feature that someone's asked you to build, ask about modules and whether anybody's used a module that does this kind of thing. You can find out more about the user group on the groups.drupal.org page, but essentially we meet almost always twice a month. We've got one meeting where it's just a happy hour. It's a little bit more relaxed, like let's hang out and have a couple beers and maybe talk about Drupal, or maybe we'll talk about bikes, or whatever the case is. And that's at the Blue Nile. Again, all of this information is on the group's website. And then we have the user group meeting, which happens towards the end of every month. It's hosted at the Advantage Lab space where the party is tonight. And that is typically a little more organized, and there's usually someone giving some kind of short presentation about, usually it's whatever people are interested in at the time. But that's been a really, really fun way to learn new things as well. Highly recommend that. And finally, remember that in Drupal, there is no magic. Like, all of this stuff, you can figure out how it works if you just take the time to open up the source and take a look at it. If you take the time to ask somebody about it. If you're involved in the community, you'll have met people and you can go and say, hey, Jeff Eaton, I heard you wrote this module. Can you tell me a little bit more about how it works? And he'll be like, oh yeah, sure, here's how it works. And so you can get a lot of knowledge from that. That's my session. That's all I got. I feel like we're like out of time, so thank you.